Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you all for coming to the Six Bridges Book Festival. It is such a pleasure to be with you tonight to discuss two amazing books, Son of My Softening by Omotara James and We Borrowed Gentleness by Josh Estanislao Lopez. I am Dr. Erica Menara, a Latin American scholar and professor from the University of Arkansas, and a poet born and raised in Peru, but evolved in the United States. So I would like to start by expressing my gratitude to Omotara and Stanislao for being here and for writing these books. In my reading of both texts, I was impressed and moved with the fact that these two authors play with language and sound to address topics such as queerness, the construction and reconstruction of the self, identity, desire, survival, violence, patriarchy, and family inheritance in such a profound and meaningful way, which opens new ways of thinking and feeling these same topics, these same concepts. So I would like to ask each one of them to talk about two words included in the titles of their books that caught my attention and that in a way serve to me as lights to enter into the books, into the reading of the books. I am referring to the word softening in the case of Omotara, and of course gentleness in the case of J. Estanislao. So would you please comment about the use of these words in your titles? We can start with Omotara, if that's okay with you.
Sure, it'll be my pleasure. It's so good to be here with you, Erica. Thank you, and you, Josh. So the title of my debut collection, Song of My Softening, it is in many ways an ode to softening. It's in many ways a song, but more than that, an archive of what it means to be soft. And I feel like each poem in the book qualifies what it means to be soft. We live in a world where shorthand is really it's what's most accessible, right? So instead of maybe like having a conversation, we want bullet points, right? So there's a lot of like erasure that happens around experience, identity. And so this idea of kind of taking more time, reclaiming time to pause and to extend connection, whether that's within one's own interior, or if that's in connection with a family member or community, or just, different, paradigms of thinking and being. Softening is really kind of an interrogation of what it means to be in connection and to stay in connection with yourself and the world around you. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you. Josh, would you like to continue?
Sure. When I was deciding on the title, I was very close to not having this title, actually, because my relationship to gentleness is an aspirational one. It's not something I was taught as a child at all. In fact, I was taught the opposite. So the verb helps me get there, right? So the idea of, maybe I cannot claim gentleness in a sort of static way, but I can borrow it for a moment, and I can enter that space without all the turmoil and turbulence involved when I think of the ways that especially masculinity is forced upon children. So yes, it's a very tenuous grasp that I have on that word, but it's a huge driving desire in the book and in my life.
And can I just say too, I love the word borrow in the title because it implies hope and community. And I think that's just hope and softness. There's such a deep relationship and discourse between those two kind of, Venn diagrams. And yeah, I love the title of your book. I just wanted to say.
I love yours as well. I really like what you say about borrowing, entailing a kind of community, a structure upon which there is gentleness to offer from somewhere, right? Which is, something to be said, a kind of a point of grace in our society, however limited in scope it might be.
And also too, just the idea of possession, borrowing something or, being a steward over something. There's a lot of grace around that, especially in this very hyper commodified and capitalist society that we're living in. The idea of having something that's borrowed and it can move through you, or you're also moving through it. It's just another way of kind of coming at that idea of connection, which I just think is tantamount.
I love listening to both of you because clearly there are some similar ideas and, some concepts that could be grasped, linking together what you are, both of you, in a way expressing a new perspective, a new way of coexisting, of co-creating this life where we live in. So I was listening also to you thinking about borrowing, to be in connection, to stay in connection, to be soft. Gentleness is a way of being soft. And I was just wondering if the pandemic that in a way forced us to be disconnected, or maybe more connected in a different way. I don't know, you can tell me about your experiences, how this impact your writing, the writing of this book. Did you write these poems before the pandemic, during the pandemic? Does the pandemic and what happened to the world has anything to do with the final product that we have now? Omotara, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I could, speak for an hour on it. I have to say that I feel like to answer the last part of your question, I feel like I've been writing this book since childhood, right? We have our early influences, we write our first poems, and I feel like I'm always revising, refining my earlier poems and trying to rewrite them into some kind of art, right? I'm moving not away from experience, but I'm honing, right? So when I think about the book and the pandemic, I have to say that the pandemic definitely has affected the outcome of the book. I had a manuscript before the pandemic that was solicited, and then the events of the pandemic in terms of connection or disconnection, for me, it was a time of deep disconnection. I have lost people, and also there was so much isolation that it kind of really forced me to turn inward, and it wasn't all great. My process just in general, as a writer, I'm writing with every poem that I'm writing has a hope in it that I can be more connected to the world. I think I kind of grew up a very lonely kid in some ways. I had friends, but I had this loneliness and this introspection that I think a lot of writers have. And so I've always felt like my poem, any poem I write, it's like a net, right? It's like a hope of finding someone who feels like I feel, or who thinks like I think, or has some kind of a similarity with me that will hold me together a little bit more, because I am a very soft, soul. And so during the time of the pandemic, with all of the isolation, on the one hand, it was very difficult to kind of move outside of my interiority, which I that's like my safe place. That's like my default, because there was danger, there was loss, but also on the other side of that, there was so many people in my life who came through for me, who were there for me. And also I wanted to be that for other people, because, loss is a community experience, whether it happens in a family or in a friendship. So I think it's, it's really like a double-edged question. There's a plurality of space that we as people are able to hold, and hopefully that translated into the work, because I'm hoping that what one person gets from a poem, someone else will get something else, just a little bit of what is needed. One poem or one collection can't be everything to everyone, but in terms of the poems that I read during the pandemic and the ones that were published during the pandemic, what I needed was definitely out there. And it was lovely to receive poems in my inbox from other poets. That was something that definitely helped keep me feeling connected when I needed to feel connected, and also something I could enjoy in the privacy of my own grief. Yeah.
Thanks, Estanislao.
So most of these poems were written before the pandemic, but the manuscript took its final shapes during the pandemic in terms of order and structure. One thing I think about when I'm thinking about this book, and sort of the time that we're living in, is when the pandemic happened, it actually kind of situated itself as part of this larger narrative, at least in my imagination, where, we had come off of a political discourse centered around hope. And of course, how hope actually enacted itself in policy, maybe it was not ideal or everyone's definition of hope, but it was the rhetoric was centered around hope, right? It was, as I said earlier, aspirational. And then we had a different political discourse, a kind of turning away from even engaging in that kind of language and turning towards despair, narcissism, self-servance. So, and then when the pandemic happened, right, in 2020, I don't know, it certainly exacerbated certain issues, but it was, to me, it fit into this kind of scheme, this kind of zeitgeist, which I'm not saying that there's any kind of something like fate going on, but it fit into a narrative that was already taking place that made us feel very, made our sense of national identity seem very suspect, especially as we would find from policy to policy, great swaths of the population didn't really care if other parts of the population lived or died. So anyway, so my imagination was in a fairly dark place, I think. And the book perhaps reflects a little bit of that darkness. when I was writing the book description, which is something you do very late in the process, I ended up using this phrase about how the book possibly, I don't know how many times I modified it, but I modified it a lot. Possibly, perhaps, maybe arrives at a shred of hope, you know? So yeah, I think that kind of, it was hard for me to get out of that space. You know, I was writing a lot of family poems, and during quarantine and after, you know, my relationship with my family became intensified for better and for worse, right? You're just constantly trying to take care um, of the vulnerable members of your family, even if they sometimes reject that care. So yeah, so there's a lot of turmoil, and that turmoil definitely was, it was in the poems I was writing already, but it definitely kind of, as I said, fit the narrative.
Thanks. So both of you have talked about hope, right? I was thinking, if the language of poetry, if the poetic language, no, if you think it could be thought as a language that currently could not help, support, I don't know, like just be with us in the process of rewriting so many concepts, so many notions, the way of living, the way we do these meetings, the way we communicate now from each other. So why writing poetry now? Why does it matter? Why should we read poetry? Why should we write poetry in the current context, post-pandemic, post these political discourses that J. Estanislao has been talking about, post this loneliness, this grief that we are still experiencing? So just wondering, what was your opinion about this?
Well, if not now, when, right? I think that for me, and I think I've hinted at this up until now, but at the very center of my praxis, right? My practice is love. I love people, and you know, I think about the poet Jericho Brown, who what did he say? He said something like, or I should say, he says that if he's writing a poem and the poem doesn't change the way the reader treats his mother or his lover or his sister, if it's not going to change something in the reader, then, you know, what's the point of writing the poem? And I agree strongly and intimately with that way of thinking. For me, you know, why now? Why poetry? The reason is because things need to change. Yeah, things kind of always need to change. That's the nature of life. But the poem, you know, as a container, it can only do so much, right? So the poem within itself holds a constraint, which I relate to. Within my own body, there are constraints, you know, everyone has some kind of constraint. There's some kind of, even though, you know, we are very much a society of saying, you know, that there's freedom, that, you know, you can go as far as you want. We're also living within like the mortal coil, within certain realities, and people have different realities and different amounts of freedom, whatever freedom means, right? It means something different, different times of day, you know, different longitudes and latitudes, depending on, you know, who's in power, depending on how educated the people are. Freedom can mean anything. So I think that the poem as a container for transformation is, I think that is the, when you get down to it, what is the smallest unit of the poem? Is it the word? Is it the music? Is it the syllable? Is it the meter? You know, for me, I measure it as, you know, transformation. What unit of transformation exists in the poem? What is something I can, you know, hear that will make me think a little differently, that will make me feel a little differently? And then how can that feeling change something, a little something, maybe make me want to take a shower that day if that's something difficult, or, you know, whatever it is. But yeah, I'm constantly writing towards love. But, you know, like Emily Dickinson said, writing towards its slant, you know, writing towards love through grief, through the lens of my girlhood, through the lens of my Blackness, through the lens of my fatness, you know, and these are all areas of discourse where a lot of change is necessary. And that is not to say that there hasn't been change, but I think now when we are so heavy with information, so heavy with politics, right? We need something that can not just tell us what's happening, like that we wear like a heavy kind of shroud, but something that can connect us to our personal agency, you know, that connect us to, okay, yeah, climate change, climate disaster rather, is all around us and it's overwhelming. But, you know, and there's a lot of it that maybe we are not personally responsible for because there are larger entities at play. But also, what can I say? What can I do today that will, you know, connect me to my own agency to thrive, to exist, to transform the world that I'm in? Because if I can't inspire myself to think of something, to do something, have a conversation with someone, learn something, then where's the hope, right? You know, there's hope in connection. And so the poems that we're writing today that are born out of what we're dealing with today, that are born out of, you know, intergenerational trauma, it's all connected on this like sliding, you know, thread. And we're writing because I'm writing because we need something to change. And I don't know, I've said change so many times, I feel like a politician, but yeah, those are my feelings. Thanks.
Thank you, Estanislao.
So I was thinking about what Omotara said, especially about freedom and agency. So poetry, we're talking about why poetry specifically, right? So poetry is one form of communication. There are, you know, I don't know, hundreds of forms of communication, of opportunities for rhetoric to shape a message. Poetry is unique in that we acknowledge the artifice of the speaker of the words, as opposed to a politician whose rhetorical manipulation, the line between their speech and their, you know, self and their agenda is flattened, right? Or it's obscured. In poetry, we acknowledge that distinction. We, with freedom, artistic freedom, comes our responsibility. And I think poets, or at least, I don't know, the poets that I admire most really take responsibility for their rhetoric, question, interrogate every metaphor, right? Every etymology. So we're, with or without poetry, we're going to be shaped. We cannot conceive thoughts outside of the language, right? So the way we think is going to be shaped by the language that we're receiving. And I think by engaging with poetry as a poet or as a reader of poetry, you're becoming more cognizant of the shapes that these rhetorical patterns take, and how they both expand or limit our understanding of ourselves and each other. So, and that's what attracts me most to poetry as a genre, is just the awareness that the poetic speaker allows a writer to spread.
Thanks. So you both have been talking about transformation, love, freedom, agency, connection, discourse. So writing poetry for you, I wonder if you experience writing poetry as a territory of risk, because of the things that you experience that you have to touch and feel when you write, but also thinking about that responsibility that Estanislao was talking about. So that idea, no, writing poetry as a space of risk. What would you say about that?
I mean, certainly, it's not necessarily a one-to-one, but there's a lot of risk. There's the risk of violence. I mean, people are in prison, have been imprisoned, stabbed, killed for what they say, for what they write. And there's also this notion of, if you don't have something to risk, why come to the page at all? I think it was Rita Dove who said, the poet Rita Dove, who said, that when she, writes a poem, if it doesn't feel like, she's going to be run out of town right after she writes it, then, what's the point? And I have to say, in a lot of ways, that's also what I believe. When I look at the page, I'm not looking necessarily at creating a piece of art. I'm trying to figure out for myself and for the speaker of the poem, what are the stakes? Why is it essential that I write the poem right now, which is, essentially what you asked earlier. And the way that I was, taught to write poetry is to ask myself, what is the occasion of the poem? And that's a question that I've borrowed and passed on to my students. What is the occasion of the poem? Why does this have to be in a poem? And usually there are many different reasons why people write, but essentially under all of those reasons, the answer is justice, to find some kind of justice. And whether that's because of something that has already transpired, that you want to write, if it's a personal wrong you want to write, you're writing a letter to someone who, it no longer exists, on this plane, on this mortal plane, and you didn't get to say what you needed to say, looking to write something, that was wrong, and doing that within this constraint of a poem. To me, I think it's better than therapy. It's a way not for me not to go crazy in this world, and to find some kind of conscious contact with my personal agency. And yeah, I'm risking, you when you write, you risk being misread, oftentimes. You risk, especially when you're, identified as a woman writer, you risk the erasure of your craft and it being labeled as completely confessional, as it being labeled as biography, which, I don't personally write biography. I use my life as a lens, but I'm writing a poem, right? I'm world building, and I'm writing to try to figure out what it is that I'm doing here. What this whole human experiment, like what's happening. So yeah, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of personal risk. And if someone is reading my poem, or even if I'm reading, like an exemplar poem of someone whose work I admire, and I read it and I don't relate to it at all, but I see why it was written, then to me, it creates meaning in my life. And I think that's something that I'm always searching for. So meaning and risk to me are, they're linked, and yeah.
Yeah, I am so on board with the importance of a poem's stake, sense of needing to be, not just being, not just decorative, but somehow tapping into an essential question of the human condition. In my poems in particular, in this book, I am exploring some fairly dark territory in terms of these inherited power structures and the inherited language. And one risk that is just always kind of creeping up my back is the risk of, in the act of interrogating that structure, participating in it. A lot of my speakers are flawed, deeply flawed. And as a poet, as the writer, it's my responsibility to expose those flaws in accordance with, there's no formulaic approach. Each poem is sort of a different measure of how self-aware I make the poem attack its speaker, versus the artifice of the poem not attacking the speaker, but by virtue of its co-conspiracy, expose what I'm always after, which is the moral truth of the poem, and not just the poem, but of people, and and the language that we use to create ourselves. So that's a risk that is always on my mind. Just, I want to address these issues. So I'm in a classroom, 1 second. It has the motion sensor on it. To address these issues in a way that has both artistic and ethical integrity, and not succumb to the archetypes that I'm trying to convince my speaker, my audience, are so threatening, and so limiting to our empathy, our kindness, and our gentleness.
Thank you, Stanislao. I have a particular question for you, because you keep talking about how you address or get inside this darkness that you write about because of violence and toxic masculinity, this ways of experience life and masculinity in an unhealthy way. But in my reading of your book, what happens, what you do in this book is to transform, to use Omotara term, that darkness and become light. Just what happened in your room right now, right? You went all dark and then there was light. Do you see that in your own process of writing this book, how you are, you are working with this concepts and realities and facts, but what happened to them at the end of the book?
Yeah. Do I? So, so ending the way the book ends, it is ending in a space of potential grace, right? It's potential grace. It's not certainly grace, but it is potential grace. But this book, the poems run again and again and again into this problem in which the language does not seem to have the capacity to hold this transformation that these speakers, or that me, not really these speakers, some of these speakers are perfectly content to be the way they are, but that I, the poet, want, right? That transformation that I want, the language, for example, just now and we both use this old archetype of darkness and light, right? Which is rooted in, these old ableist and racist structures, or at least it's been used to justify and amplify those structures. The archetypes are all around us, and they are constantly making us participate in their survival. So I know the way the book ends. I do acknowledge that it could read as, a transformative arc, but I as little control as a writer has over their book, right? As the writer, I hereby declare that not necessarily, right? It's a potential transformation, but there's this bottlenecking that the language is forcing, that's acting as a hindrance to that transformation.
I have to thank you for what you just said. I feel like, are you walking around inside my brain? Because I feel like you might be, because we're on the same wavelength. I was just thinking about the limitations of language as you were, conversing. And I was thinking about, the African poet, Chris Abani, something that he said in a workshop to us once, which was that, language, all language is a failure of communication, but, the point is to fail brilliantly. You know, that's why we're writing poems, to fail brilliantly with some brilliance. And you know, there are so many limitations to our language, and that is something that I'm always thinking about, because, you know, as if language is, you know, like our, you know, currency, you know, in this capitalist paradigm, if language is our currency, and you know, it's both the bridge to that connection, but also it's a way of, you know, disconnecting us. It's a way of you know, there's so much misadventure in language, so many ways for it to go disastrously wrong, even with the best of intentions. And so, you know, especially, you know, when I think about language and how that functions within, you know, my own, you know, family, how it has functioned and informed my upbringing, you know, I think of all the places and all the times that it has gone terribly wrong, or all the times we haven't been able to find the words, right? I think about that often, and I revisit those moments in my poems. And, you know, I can't say that I am the, you know, the judge. Like if the poem is the justice, that I'm the judge and I have the perfect words, and, you know, even knowing everything that I, you know, didn't know then, I can't necessarily, just like with time, you know, the poem can't correct everything, right? It can't be used or commodified in that way. And in so many ways, like, you know, sometimes the best we can hope for is, you know, an honest rendering. You use the word integrity. And that's what I think a lot of us are working towards, you know, an honest rendering, you know, even though as poets, we are still people with our own agendas that are also working in the poems, making us complicit to what we are railing against, writing against. That always has to be factored in. But even to that end, I think that if we can acknowledge the limits of language with some generosity, which is what I think you're also saying, then that creates, again, you know, an opening, some possibility, some hope.
I think that reading is a far more, you know, authentic path to hope. You know, maybe in all poetry, right? Then the idea of the epiphanic transformation, right? The idea that a character becomes self-aware and corrects their flaws moving forward. It in my experience, in my life experience, it doesn't work that way, you know. It's about, you know, that yeah, it's about the hope of generosity, the malleability that it allows, right? I feel like so many forces are trying to ossify the spirit, harden it, and the greatest poems reintroduce the fluidity, that the spirit is etymologically the breath, which is shapeless, right? Which can fill anything and take any shape. So yes, I totally agree with you on that.
And sometimes the poem is rejected. And I don't mean like for submissions. I mean, you know, sometimes people don't want to hear about the poems. They don't want to see the poems. And that's, you know, that's part and parcel, you know, that is part of the experience. And oftentimes, you know, the people, you know, that I want to read my poems the most, maybe someone in my life, you know, I know they're never going to read that poem, you know, and even if they, and even if they do, what can I say? I am a glutton for punishment. And even if they do, they won't necessarily receive it the way that I would, intend. But, I again, not to be the politician of the evening, but I have to believe that these interrogations and language with all of its limitations and frailties, we're in a better position as a community. And even just in communing with myself, I'm in a better position if I can think through what I have experienced and give it some kind of a voice,
Well, thank you both for this fascinating exchange. And I would like to ask you now if you feel comfortable reading some of your poetry, sharing it with us. I mean, each one of you could read between 3 and 5 minutes, if that's okay with you, or less, whatever you want. Omotara, would you like to start?
Sure, it would be my pleasure.
Thanks.
I just would like to thank you again for moderating this conversation. Your questions have been really insightful, and I appreciate your deep listening. And Josh, it's been a real pleasure to be in conversation with you. So I will just read like 2 poems, 2 pretty short poems, and just the first poem I'm going to read is, again, along the same lines of everything that we've just been speaking about on the limitations of language, and in particular, that word dark. And it's so funny that came up tonight, but it's exactly why I'm writing the poem. It's an occasion. It's the occasion for the poem. That word dark and the language, is how can you have in a language this word dark that is a placeholder for a people, and for evil, and for uncertainty, and for like all of this like real dangerous slippage and these tropes that build our society, and then wonder, how are we going to get away from racism? Like, how is that possible when the language that we're steeped in, that we repeat and perpetuate every day, is steeped in that, in our, our even of our most brilliant thinkers. So this poem is called Dark Hallelujah. And the only 2 things that you might need to know are that, Dr. Martin Luther King was friends with Mahalia Jackson, the amazing gospel singer, and he was known to call her in the middle of the night when he needed some spiritual, some spiritual TLC, essentially. And eurythmy is a type of interpretive dance. And I think that's all you need to know for this poem. Dark Hallelujah. The dark soul of Gregory Hines' tap across the Apollo stage. Mid-dark, like Mahalia's midnight alto for Martin. Dark water, where the wave returns to the sea, from where it rises. Deep dark, where it roils, raptures, and gently speaks thunder. Coiled tight as the flight of the water dancer's pointed toe when it flexes. Dark as the thigh, closing the gap. Black, as in no need for precedence. Firsts are irrelevant. The melody sprinting beneath the lyrics. The beauty omnipotent. Dark as the pleasures yet to be named. What remains undiscovered. The darkness that draws you so near. For a moment, we all disappear. So dark, no one knocks on my door when the lights are out. Dark-skinned, as in the secret universe that exists between us. The joy, all for us. Tightly coiled, as the black belt of the choral refrain, again and again, coiled like the corners of your heart's labyrinth, mama. The dark mass of the pendulum as it swings unmeasured through space. The sun doesn't blaze without the infinite twirl of its dark skirts, the undershine of its belly telling the black croon of its broil, tightly coiled, like the vine let go the grape, coiled dark, as in within striking distance, black like the back of the bus on the way to the Museum of Natural History, when Marcus sang, "Lift every voice and sing," and Nathan started crunking, and Natasha pulled out her eurythmy moves, so Lakeisha got beatboxing, and I wanted to join in drumming, but just watched my black pupils humming. And I'm just gonna read one last poem. This one is titled On Repetition, and the subtext is definitely, violence and the repetition of violence and how it's enacted in different ways, how it will eventually get to us. On repetition. No one gives a damn about a poem until they need a poem. The poet is a poem. My mother is a poem. Women are poems. Black women are poems. Black people are poems who need poems. Black labor is a poem another person will say they wrote. Black babies are weeds. No one thinks a fat person is a poem. At most, an anthem. Disability poems can be read when an abled person says so. The urge toward poetry is a type of soil. A Black death is a poem we clamor to sing. What I said before about Black people is half a poem. Black intellect is a diving board, a wellspring, a tornado, a patient lava. Black poems show you everything about the world you claim to love. Love is a muscle the poem exercises, or not. A weed in the mouth of the poem is a fruit. Thank you.
Thank you, Motora. Estanislao,
Love
would you
that
like to
last.
go?
I'll read one poem kind of on theme. Um, what we as to what we were discussing. Static. One great metaphor can ruin a life, and we have invented several. The born fruit, the eternal battle between darkness and light. Geometricians of the ancient world grappled with the difference between two names and two names within a circle. In his phone conversation, a father spoke of how after he left, he would brush his teeth in the dark, as if it were anything more than photons bouncing back at him. Sometimes a word must be fabricated from its brass and bloodshed. Sometimes just its utterance fractures dinnerware left for another to watch. Solar winds in the atmosphere fill the phone conversation with static. Airwaves alight with Genesis, a fraction of what interrupts us coinciding with creation itself. My father, I say to him, can't you see you are a figment in someone's dark imagination? My father, turn on the lights and realize that you're alone. He rolls an orange across grass yellowing from the shade of gardenias. He lays a jackal inside a burning bassinet. Thank you so much for hosting us. I've really enjoyed my time here and it was great meeting everybody.
Thank you to both of you for being so honest and for getting also in risk in this session to talk about these topics, these ideas, these feelings, these sensations, these pains, these griefs. So I think we can end now. Again, thank you all to the people we cannot see, but that have been listening to us, to the people that are translating, to the people that put together this Zoom session and that have been working so we can talk today and be together and think together and feel together. It's been my honor to listen to you and to talk to you. Thank you so much. Have a good night.